I know everyone's here for mushrooms and you guys are like fungal lovers, but we're going to cover plants and bacteria as well and talk about conventional remediation, contaminants, how everything works together. A lot of the questions that came up actually in the circle, talking about what do we do with the waste, what do we do with things when we're dealing with like salt water, I heard that was a question. We're going to try to maybe answer some of those. And what we can't answer, we're going to have to brainstorm about because there's a lot of information that isn't out there that needs to be learned and figured out. So before we get started, I guess I just want to know who here has ever done a permaculture course? A little permaculture course?
Yeah, just have learned something about it.
2-day workshop.
Yeah, what you?
I've learned some about it, but not, just out of community studies, but I've done like young groups, which is like a program where you teach children permaculture, so it's like 3 days.
Okay. Does anybody know what permaculture means? This can be a really awkward conversation when you're like at a party and someone's like, this permaculture thing, what does that mean? What do you say to them?
Is it like sustainable gardening? I don't know.
That can be, that's a part of it.
It's a frame of mind and action.
Yeah.
Of like a permanent.
No, go ahead.
Finish your thought.
Finish it. You got something. Go ahead.
A permanent culture, like creating a closed loop system that can continue to function.
Yes, that's actually a big one. So the word permaculture comes from, it started out coming from permanent agriculture. These guys down in Australia were like, they coined the term. And they coined the term, but they didn't like actually, like a lot of the stuff that they were kind of putting under permaculture comes from tried and true and long-term different forms of knowledge that have been out there for a while about how to work with the land in a respectful and sustainable way. But they were initially trying to address agriculture, and then they expanded it to say, we actually have to be looking at a permanent culture. So how do we find ways to live on this planet where we're meeting our needs, but we're also meeting the needs of other species because we actually depend on each other? And how do we find ways to not just meet our needs, but restore and regenerate the systems and the landscapes and the watersheds that we're a part of because we need those things, right? So that's a big piece of it. Any other ones? I saw some of the
I was
hands up.
just going to say that it's like a holistic view of way of looking at growing things and interacting with other life forms.
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
I like the phrase, one organism's waste is another organism's treasure.
Boom.
And it's
Yeah.
like, why do we have so many wastes as humans? It's because we're putting them in the wrong places. And so it's just keeping everything in a cycle.
Mm-hmm. Like wasted food. Yeah, that can definitely be something. I see another hand up. No? Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I guess just the fact that like we have these relationships that like we accept waste, and it's like usually, I mean, waste is like kind of a man-made like thing. Like it should be like food for something else to digest, or like it should just have a place to go back and like just about like continuing that cycle, not necessarily. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think one thing that's interesting is that in all the work that we're doing, whether it's the remediation work, permaculture, if you're an activist and you're kicking ass in different ways, we're always, what we've inherited is a pretty messed up situation, right? And we're dealing not just with contaminated and destroyed landscapes, but with a culture that at its kind of base creates that situation over and over again. And so we have a culture that really is about kind of linear things. It's about disconnecting and cutting apart things instead of bringing them back together and weaving them into a web. And so oftentimes in permaculture, we're trying to find out, we're looking at a system and we're trying to find the ways to actually allow it to come back and bring back the cycles. Because there were cycles before that actually allowed that system to operate on its own in a way that met its needs. But because of some of our actions, and maybe the actions of people, our ancestors, we've damaged those processes and those cycles to the point where those needs cannot be met. And I think we know we can do this in our own bodies, and we've done that to the planet to a certain degree. And so as a permaculture designer or a practitioner, you're kind of coming into a landscape, you're looking and seeing what is gone from this landscape, right? Like, is the water cycle actually operating? Do we have an active soil food web? Is this landscape just prone to mad erosion? Where's the fire regime, right? Maybe it was a landscape that was developed by fire, and now we've suppressed fire for 100 years and we have a problem, right? And so it's looking at these landscapes, trying to read them again and listen and learn, and then find ways to reconnect those cycles so that in the beginning we're going to be doing some interventions to kind of bring things back online, but we're going to bring them back online to the point where they're going to start doing it for themselves again, right? And so that's kind of when I think about permaculture, it's one of the things I think about. It's basically based on looking at nature and learning from its brilliant designs and working as nature works. So the whole concept of being biomimetic or mimicking nature, right? And that can mean everything from like, you know, looking at a stream and how it flows and then trying to bring that back or kind of use that as a way that you flow water through a landscape. Or it can be working with the different allies that are been doing this work. If we think about plants and mushrooms and bacteria, and they've been doing the work of healing the landscape, of, you know, breaking down, you know, contaminants or even just like waste materials for a very long time. And so when we're talking about doing grassroots remediation, we're not talking about bringing in big machines and chemicals and like bombing the landscape into better, right? Or cleaner, but kind of sterile. We're talking about actually working with living things to bring that back in a more holistic way, which is often a slower way, right? Permaculture isn't like super, super fast. It's slower, and what you come to is more of a resilient balance. And that's kind of what I think about permaculture. It doesn't, you know, it's a big kind of buzzword for the last 5 years, 10 years. So sometimes people are talking about it and they're not necessarily doing it. Other times they're rocking it out. It's evolved in the last 5, 10 years. If not, it's been going on for a long time. But yeah, just something to think about. There's a lot of people doing this work right now. So if you guys want to go learn more about permaculture, there's 2-week design courses where you kind of go deep. And it's still kind of like a bit of a buffet, like you cover a whole range of things, but it's a really neat place to start. I find it's especially helpful if you kind of grew up without kind of a land education. If you didn't come from the land, if your people weren't working deep with the land, like I grew up in a city, and so I have very little history of kind of understanding how nature works. So I can be doing something and I won't actually know that that's not how nature works, right? Like I didn't know that nothing is in a straight line in nature, right? Straight lines don't happen. That's a human thing, and that causes a lot of problems. And I needed someone to tell me that because I grew up in a city, right? So it can be really good for that. Yeah, I would just recommend people learn about it. A few things before we move on to the principles is permaculture is based on ethics. That's what folks like to say. And those ethics kind of flow through the different principles and also how people practice it. But the main 3, they kind of sound like Care Bear anthems a little bit, but it's earth care, people care, and fair share. So it's like everything you're doing have to take those 3 things into account, right? So whatever kind of intervention or land work you're doing, is it actually going to make the land healthier, right? And is it also going to be good for people? Is it going to make your community more resilient, make people in your community healthier? And then finally, fair share is about finding ways to make sure that everybody's getting their needs met. And some permaculture folks just kind of leave it at that. Other folks like to get a little bit more radical and talk about fair share in terms of like a longer term idea of justice. That doesn't happen a lot in permaculture. It should happen more, so I won't go there. But you can go there. Permaculture principles. So there's a bunch of different principles, and I'm going to go through them. And what I think would be really awesome is while we're kind of just doing everything else this weekend, I'm going to put them on the wall, and you can just kind of keep coming back to them. And again, they're just guidelines. Like what I find when I read a lot of these is that they're kind of common sense if you grew up in a way where you were connected to landscape, right? Like that's actually how we should be doing things. So none of it's rocket science, but just some things to kind of keep in mind as you're doing any kind of earthwork, right? And I think especially remediation work. So is this good? Is this making sense? Yeah? I actually haven't taught permaculture in a couple years, so I'm like freestyling right now. So the first principle with permaculture, and I think again it has same thing with like remediation work, is you have to observe. So you don't come into a landscape and say, oh my God, I have this great idea. I've seen this landscape for the first time, or this site for the first time today, and I'm just going to do this thing. You don't do that in permaculture. Do you know why?
It's not going to fit.
It might not fit. It might fit, but it also might not fit, right? And also you might make some pretty gnarly mistakes. And then correcting your mistakes is a lot harder than just moving a bit slow in the beginning and kind of avoiding certain things. A lot can be avoided by taking your time, and observation is really key, especially if we don't really understand the systems that we're working with, or on first glance, we don't really know what to look for and what to listen to. Taking the time to really look at a place, to really see how things move through that place, right? And maybe even ask certain questions about what was there before or what's there now. And things look different in different seasons. So you could put a really amazing, remediation installation up in spring, and then if you've never been in that place before, you don't know how, maybe there's something that's going to happen in summer or fall that blows out your remediation installation because you didn't have a chance to kind of observe and kind of look and see. And you might do something and it might not work, and you're going to observe that, and then you're going to slightly modify it and tweak it. So it's this kind of concept of like taking the time, getting to know a place, and then kind of moving a little bit slower, but with a lot more wisdom, right? That observation also is not just what we see with our eyes, it's what we hear, it's the communications we have with the different people who have maybe been stewards with that place, as well as the different like plants and fungi that are there. So really, really important is that you can't make a good permaculture design, or I would say a remediation project, if you haven't taken time to sit with the place that you're in. And they always talk about how in permaculture, the designer is the recliner. So like take some time to just lay the fuck down and look around. That's kind of what I think. Not too much time, but like, you know, and to do it at different times of the year. The other thing with permaculture is that we're trying to connect things. We're trying to reconnect all the different pieces, as I said, that have been snipped apart. And so when you're trying to, I don't know, like do rehabilitation work or even start a community garden or something like that, you don't want to have all these different pieces in isolation. You want to try to find ways to connect them. And the more things are connected, the more resilient it's going to be, right? So just trying to find ways to kind of weave things together, make sure that they're supporting each other. Does that make sense? Yeah, and we'll talk about, I think for remediation, that needs to happen, right? And also, this is not just connecting like species to species, but also they talk about relative location a lot in permaculture. So you have something somewhere, like in the landscape, and you're trying to connect it to the different kind of flows and other features in that landscape to make it grow better or be more effective, right? The other thing they talk about is finding all the different ways to catch and store energy or water as well in your system, right? So that you're not always having to bring that stuff in, you're finding ways within your system to actually hold those things. Because we do have a problem where we've created whole environments where that stuff just comes running right off. If you think about water, for example, it's like oftentimes we don't necessarily have like a deficit of water, we have trouble keeping water where it should be, right? We have all this water running down into storm sewers and then down into the rivers instead of sinking it and storing it in land. And so there's a whole bunch of different permaculture tools and techniques that actually address things like how do you catch and store water in the landscape and where's the best place to do it. And what happens when we don't kind of store those things, we actually end up with destruction in different forms. And the same is true with energy, like finding ways, if you're in a climate that's quite cold, or for example, I'm going to try to read this in more remediation, but we know that things like microbes like it to be warm. They work quicker when things are warmer. So if you're in a colder climate and you're trying to do microbial remediation, if you can find a way to kind of sink more heat by, you know, I don't know, using thermal mass and finding ways to like the little heat that you're getting, actually kind of store it longer and kind of amplify it out into the environment, that's something you might want to think about, right? Because it'll actually help your remediation go a bit quicker. The other two things that are kind of go together is the concept of each element in your system performs multiple functions. So again, you don't have like these monocultures where like one thing does one thing and only that one thing. You have one thing that's not, you don't just have it there and it does like, it's just good for this. It's doing a bunch of different things at the same time. So like a plant is not only good because it might be pulling up different contaminants, but it might also be creating a really good habitat for the microbes and all the different sugar exchanges that are coming between them that's allowing for microbial remediation to happen, right? So there's like a bunch of different things happening there. It's also holding the soil, right, at your site and keeping soil and stuff from like moving and water from running off and contaminating other sites. So that's important to think about. So trying to make sure that, like, again, things have multiple things, they're connected to multiple places in your system. And at the same token, each function is supported by multiple elements. So if you have something you're trying to have happen in your system or in your design, if it only like it's, I'm trying to think of it, there's lots of good examples of this, but let's say you have polluted water running into your site and you only have one, I don't know, bunker bag there to kind of stop it and infiltrate it before it gets to a river, right? If something happens with that one bag, is that a good thing? No. So you might want to have a couple other things that are also trying to intercept that polluted water, or that when it gets to that river, that lake, there's something else to help clean up. You know what I mean? So just kind of thinking that way. And that kind of builds like resiliency in the system. They also call it like planned redundancy, because we all know that things sometimes fail. And if you have a little bit of a backup system, you'll do a lot better. Any questions with this? Is it making sense? Does this seem applicable? Okay, good. Because I'm like, oh, it's a little bit on the side, but you know, we're doing it. Number 6 is like my favorite one. And I feel like I'm saying this often because this is not something our society understands at all. So anytime we're doing any kind of earthwork, it's part of observation, but it's also, we kind of start small and we make the least change for the greatest effect, right? So you don't come in there and say, oh my God, I have this amazing idea, I'm gonna do it throughout the whole landscape and hope it works. Because if it doesn't work, again, you have a big cleanup job on your hand or you might cause a lot of damage. So when I think about like societally how this kind of pans out, as I said, I'm from Alberta, right? We have the tar sands. About 20 years ago, we started building these crazy giant mines to extract unconventional oil. And back then, all the companies, they basically would send in reports and say, so we're going to build these crazy mines, but we think we know how to clean it up. I hope that's okay. And the government said, well, it looks like you think you know how to clean it up. Let's do this. And then 20 years later, we have an area that's about the size of Florida, and getting bigger all the time. And all the ways they said that they could actually clean it up, it's not working. That's when you're kind of screwed, right? And if they had started small, and maybe they would have learned that a lot earlier. You know what I mean? Start small, see if it works. Oh, it doesn't work? Maybe we're going to slow down. Then instead of like do, and then all of a sudden at the end, you have a huge debt to recover. So in our own work, not that any of us are going to build tar sands. I really hope not. In our own work, we need to be kind of moving a bit slower and trying to do these smaller interventions. The same thing when you're driving. If you start doing big corrections and you start to lead, you lose control of your car and of the system. So just kind of think about that. Again, using kind of small scale intensive systems and growing them, it's kind of like as you get kind of more savvy to the system you're working with and you understand it better, you grow it a little bit more and a little bit more. And the whole point is like things are a lot more solid when they're kind of smaller scale, right? And the more large we get, the more kind of factors and forces come into play, and sometimes we can deal with those and sometimes we can't. So a lot of permaculture is kind of bringing things down more local and into a more manageable scale for humans so that we're not dependent on machines and other crazy interventions. Another permaculture principle that can be really interesting and helpful is the idea of optimizing edge and just the whole concept of edge. So edges are where you have two different, let's say, sites or systems or ecosystems, and there's a whole bunch of species over, let's say, in a forest ecosystem, and there's a whole bunch of species over in a meadow, but actually the most diversity is found where the two meet. Because you have the species of both present, and then a whole other kind of subset of species that live just in the edge. And so, because we're trying to bring diversity back, because we live in a world of monocultures, where we're constantly like homogenizing everything, the more edge we can kind of give to our systems, the more surface area, things like that, the more resiliency and diversity we're gonna have. And that does play out in remediation sometimes, and I'm gonna talk about that a little bit later. Another one that's really cool that kind of plays into remediation is the idea of collaborating with succession, or as permaculture folks like to call it, the succession of evolution, just because it sounds really cool. It's hard to explain what that actually means. But do people understand what succession means? The word succession?
Isn't that right after or something?
Say that again?
Does it mean like after?
Yeah, it means, I think it means many things, but like when I think about it in terms of nature, it's like, nature's kind of always moving to a certain balance, and there's different kind of phases of that, right? So a system can start off, like sand, and then different species come in and they kind of like do their thing, and then other species come in, and then they slowly like move towards a meadow, and then that moves towards a forest, and it's like kind of crawling towards like a, a certain set, and every species has its own kind of dynamic equilibrium and where it's going to kind of come to rest depending on the different interventions that happen. But there is a flow, right? Different species follow different species in succession. Different phases of succession have kind of different communities that are a part of them. Often in conventional remediation and restoration efforts, they come into big problems because they'll basically have a damaged ecosystem and they'll say, okay, we need to move on in about 5 months so that we can like say that we did our cleanup effort, check. We're going to pound this piece of ground full of a bunch of trees and be like high five and roll out. And usually what happens is those trees die because there wasn't the right successional phase, right? They kind of jumped the gun and they needed to actually do the work of bringing that landscape to that place that could actually support trees. Does that make sense? Yes. And they actually call that, in that kind of remediation work, they call that successional incompatibility. So it's important to kind of actually work with the system. And if you want a certain kind of plant, fungal, microorganism community, you have to do the work and kind of create the right kind of factors and kind of, preceding conditions to get there, right? And you can design a system to get you there, but you need to think about that. And that means you need to kind of look at your system and be like, where is it in this march, right? So yeah, does that make sense? Okay. I swear, I'm like super permaculture grassroots. The neat thing about permaculture is at a certain point in the game, you just start kind of thinking like this, and some of you might already think like this, so you're fine. Permaculture also really big on using biological and renewable resources. So whenever you're trying to address a problem, you're trying to avoid things like, oh hey, we're going to mine some really awesome amendment and use that to make our system better. Because if you do that, you're just making a problem somewhere else. So you're trying to kind of work locally, kind of, you said closed loop systems as much as possible, like working with what's already on the land. And use things that are actually renewable so that we're not creating more toxic legacies or more forms of scarcity elsewhere. Yeah, and using biological as much as possible. So again, we're talking about using microremediation, anything with mushrooms, anything with plants, bacteria. We're working with our living allies to do the work instead of what the system does, or I guess conventional remediation, because they're not working with biological forms of remediation. They're bringing in chemicals and mechanical things to do the same thing, which is usually way more detrimental to the environment and doesn't actually bring back the landscape the same way. The other one is finding ways to turn problems into solutions. And another way to look at that is, I think someone said like waste is food. Was that you who said that? That's another permaculture principle, but this is kind of like an optimistic point where permaculture people are like, hey, sometimes we can take really bad things and make them better. Or waste might look like waste to some people, but actually there is something in this world that might have evolved to eat that or use that in some way, and we need to find a way to bring that into the landscape or into the system that we're working with. So there's a lot of different ways to look at that. For example, like bacteria like the oil, right? Like I was talking to this one soil biologist. Her name is Elaine Ingham. I don't know if people have heard about Elaine Ingham. She's really cool, compost tea lady, like big soil biology, like remediation stuff. And she was talking about how basically for every nasty kind of contaminant that we probably know is out there, there is some microorganism that could probably eat it. But it's about finding which one that is and then creating the environment that would actually allow it to kind of come into your system. So that's one thing. Another example of turning a problem into a solution is, so we have an issue, let's say, people know about how we have all this like nutrient runoff going into lakes and rivers, yeah, and it's creating dead zones. Like all the kind of fertilizer runoff from the fields, we have all this phosphorus, all this nitrogen, all this stuff, and it's like hitting the water and then basically making lakes and rivers unable to support fish and a lot of other aquatic life. And I was working with some folks up in Montana, and they've been doing these things where they create something called a floating island. And it's kind of, I'm going to talk about it later, but it's like a remediation installation that helps clean the water and oxygenate the water so that fish can come back. And what's interesting is the fish come back and then they start to hyperaccumulate a lot of the phosphorus because they're eating all the other like things in their meat food chain. And so they become kind of like holding a lot of this phosphorus stuff in their body and their bones. And then if you remove the fish from the lake, you can use it as fertilizer. Because right now we're mining phosphorus, we're running out of phosphorus. But that's all ending up in our lakes and our rivers. Right? And so how do we get that out and actually use it for something? And not just use it for things like fertilizer, but phosphorus is really helpful if you're trying to deal with lead contamination, right? Because lead, if you have lead contaminated soil and you add phosphorus to that, and it's the right kind of phosphorus, and it just happens to be that fish bones are the most like soluble kind of phosphorus that'll combine really well with lead in soil. If you add that, it'll actually turn lead into something called lead pyromorphite, which is more inert and unable to be taken up by plants. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a way, like, again, to turn something that's kind of not a great situation and find a way to make it helpful. Number 12 is another permaculture design thing. It's called get a yield. I'm not as into it, but it's basically saying any system that you're working with, you're trying to also design it for some form of productivity, right? Like you're going to get something from it so that you can actually like feed yourself or like feed something in the system. I'm not that big onto that, but I also think in terms of remediation, I think, did someone ask about how to sustain long-term remediation projects as a question? I don't know if that came up.
Yes.
It did come up. So we're going to hit that, I think, also later, like starting with groups and like doing kind of the social piece of this. But when you think about how to motivate people, and it's hard enough to get people to actually come and do community gardens where they're actually going to eat something. I don't know if people have ever been part of like a volunteer effort like that. People do it for a while and then they get kind of bored and they find other fun things to do. If you're going to try to hold on to this, like do this work, and remediation takes, like it's not like a season. It can take 2 years, 3 years, 50 years. Like it can take a while depending on what you're working with. You need to find a way to hook people and keep them interested. And so I tend to think about, when I'm talking about get a yield in a remediation situation, it's like you need to have something that people are getting out of that project, right? Whether it's community, whether somehow you found a way to have some of your land being remediated, but also you're growing something over here so that people can be harvesting something. People are motivated by that kind of stuff. So finding a way to kind of have people and other things in the system benefit from the system is important. Any ideas on that? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. If I'm talking too fast, because I do that when I'm excited, just do this. Just fist pump, because then I'll feel good about myself, but I'll also slow down. And that's really important. Right? Fist pump, because I like that. Finally, final one, and there's tons, but these are like the common ones. When it comes to permaculture, and I would say again, any kind of work that we're doing that's awesome, the biggest limit to abundance or to that kind of, to what we're doing is our own creativity, right? And so really, they often say that there's a lot of limitations out there, but we just really need to apply our brilliant minds, and the more minds we have together, the more we can kind of start to kind of push the edges out and figure out how to handle things differently. Right? Because often you'll come into situations like I feel with remediation right now, a lot of people will tell you, oh, this won't work, that won't work, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. And there's some truth to some of that, and some of that is really outdated, or people kind of tried, but they didn't try the right way. And so I think there's a big need for people to put their heads together and to try to figure out how to go forward and to get really creative. So some of the neatest things I've seen when it comes to mushroom stuff has been not because people just kind of read what was in front of them and did that. It was because they were like, oh, I want to do things differently, and I'm just going to spend the next 2 years of my life tinkering around and getting it. And so like the culture of people who are, I'm not going to say this right, who tinker, right? Who don't just want to be experts and specialize and don't want to make mistakes, but who actually want to like play around with something and just keep tweaking and tweaking and tweaking and trying kind of crazy things out is really important, because that's kind of one of our only ways to move forward, because we're dealing with some pretty heavy stuff and some pretty entrenched issues, right? So creativity, awesome. Creativity with your friends, even better. Good?
Great.
Yeah?
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So to wrap up permaculture, again, usually when people do permaculture, it's a 2-week course, and you go through it and you talk about everything from plants to mushrooms to composting. People talk about how to use animals and kind of integrate them into the landscape. We talk about different ways to catch and store water, like we talk about swales and like rainwater harvesting, and how to use, like, for example, using animals in your land to bring back fertility and to also like simulate like kind of the wild herds and stuff like that. Like that's all part of permaculture. We're not going to get there, but if you guys want to ask me questions about that, or you have ideas and you want to talk about that, we can. But we just want you to have some of these principles just to even just apply it this week, you know? And again, and just to remember that so much of this work is about, like if all you remember from permaculture is work as nature works, try to mimic nature, that is like, that's what it's about. It's about looking at a system and being like, okay, how has it done what it's done? What's missing? How do we bring it back? And how do we bring it back in a wise and respectful way, where it's not just about us as humans, it's about everything. And we're sharing the bounty with all the other beings. Because I think often, in a lot of work I know that I do, whether it's activism or farming or gardening, we're always talking about kind of abundance between humans. We're getting really stoked that we're going to farm this or farm that, and we have these giant harvests, or that we had this amazing protest. And we don't always take a moment and actually look at the land and be like, how's it doing? And what did I give back today? And what are my responsibilities? Right? And that's a really big piece that should be under ethics, but the fact that we have a lot of responsibilities. And that's not just things that we have to do and uphold in the landscape, but also our ability to respond to what's happening right now, because things are moving really fast. And there's a lot of situations where the land isn't kind of used to what's going on, and I think we could be doing a lot of work to make things more resilient. So that's a part of it.
Keep the big picture in mind.
Keep the big picture in mind, yeah, but also pay attention to the details. You know what I mean? So, important work. Good to move on? All right, we're gonna do this now.
Permaculture activism.
Yeah. Boom. Yeah. Before I start talking, because I actually want to take a breath, we wanted to ask you guys, who here has kind of done remediation projects before? A show of hands. Or you've like played around with trying something out. Okay. Do you want to briefly kind of tell me what you did? Because I want to know. Everybody wants to know. You want to go first?
I've been working on a microfiltration system, but it's been taking me a long time just trying to figure out like what specific contaminant, how to get it into the water if it's hydrophobic, all the different variables to keep the mycelium alive, the ratio of water flow to contaminant to mycelium to time exposure, how often to test it. There's so many variables that it's like, and there's no one answer. You can't go to an expert and ask them. Like, it's all trial and error and documenting it and proving that you're doing it right and proving that it's, you know, if it's the mycelium that if that's your hypothesis that the mycelium's breaking down the contaminant, you got to make sure that all your controls are set up to prove that and that it can be replicable.
Cool.
So it's hard.
But you're doing it, that's awesome.
I'm trying.
Other people? Hands, I saw hands. Or I'll point the power finger.
So in my work in an auto recycling place, I've done some experiments. I have to do stormwater pollution prevention, so we have drains in our yard, and before I started working there, the water was just going down the drain and right into the rivers. So I found some filters that a fisherman had invented, and we put those in, but then they clog quickly, and then you have all these highly contaminated sediments. So I used those and used oyster mushrooms. And I just looked at hydrocarbons because that was kind of the easiest and cheapest thing to do. But a couple experiments worked well, and then I did a little playing around with microfiltration with limited success. But
Awesome.
I helped to install a big oyster mushroom diesel soil lasagna with myceliated burlap, straw, and soil that was contaminated by diesel and motor oil. Quite a bit of it. It was like 90 yards of soil or something. And I helped with one phase of that installation process.
And how long, like where is it at?
It's in Orleans, California, which is
Yeah.
right by the confluence of the Klamath River. And it's like literally this project is a stone's throw from the river itself. In alluvial river soil. It's just like the spill was ongoing leak for like 40 years into the soil. So it's a fairly big project. And I'll present, I have a PowerPoint that somebody else made that I'll present on that later in the week.
I was just in Orleans.
Oh,
Yeah.
did you see it?
No, because I didn't know it was there.
Oh, it was fun. Do you
Yeah.
know the McQuick kind of community center behind there?
Next time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. And did you raise your hand for?
I've done some things, but I don't think it really counts. It's kind of different. It's more like plant related.
Okay.
So it's kind of
Well,
like.
we're gonna be talking about plants. This
Okay.
might be the one time we talk about plants. And we
Okay,
can be
yeah.
from like just the mushroom orgy, so.
Okay, cool, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's more like this, maybe, I don't know if it's called remediation, if you would do like species removal, like invasive species removal and things like that. Because I've done plenty of, Scotch broom and Washington, like all over the place, those kind of things. I'm not sure if that really is considered remediation, but
Yeah.
it's like taking the invasive species out of the land. But.
I think some people might consider that.
Yeah.
Often when we're talking about remediation, like remediation is like an industry term that we just kept using. But remediation is often dealing more with like contaminants and getting rid of contaminants. So you could, some people might define an invasive species as a contaminant, but more often than not we're talking about the chemicals and the metals and the radiation. But it is part of like restoration, rehabilitation, regeneration work.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah. Is that it, or was there other hands? Yeah.
Well, Monica's going to present on this later, but in Orinda, which is in the East Bay area, or like kind of beyond the East Bay, further east, the East Bay Municipal Utilities District has a piece of land that has a bunch of cows grazing on it, and they had a lot of concerns about one of the waterways there, and because that's where the water comes from. This area, this land is where all the water comes, the drinking water for the whole Bay, East Bay area. So there's a bunch of cows grazing on this land right near this waterway, and so what we did is we mixed up Stropharia redusa annulata, the garden giant, spawn with wood chips and straw, and put them in burlap sacks, and put them in a little creek, and let the water run through it. And there's a whole description of this in, actually on page 97, I think.
Cool. That's it.
done is kind of working with plants and like trying to re-increase like soil fertility. There was like a lot of like pesticides and herbicides sprayed on this area, and so there was like this influx of like poison hemlock and just like different plants where you like they're just signs of like contaminated soils and or like parasitic soils. So like yeah, I just did like sheet mulching and just like different things, kind of like nursing weeds and like just kind of have watched like the succession of different plants come back and just have seen like the fertility in the soil get like increase, and it's I don't know, just kind of like
Right on. Okay, good. Yes.
We installed bunker bags at our co-op, our East Side Co-op, to filter the runoff from the parking lot, the Rodas Australis. And we haven't been able to test it yet, but you can see the difference, which is cool. You can see like the difference on a rainy day, how like the oil is at the beginning, and then at the end it's like clear and really nice and pretty. But we would like to be able to test it. The testing is just so hard to afford. So,
Cool. We'll talk about that a little bit. Awesome. So, got some good experience in the room. I mean, basically there's not a lot of this stuff actually happening as much as it should be happening, right? Like in some ways people have been talking about using mushrooms to clean up oil spills and plants to like suck up heavy metals for at least I know 8 years, 9 years, because that's when I started hearing about it. But then when you kind of go on the ground and you go into communities, you're like, why aren't we doing that more? And it's because there are some actual challenges in the mix in terms of like, as you said, like things like soil testing costing money, certain governments and bureaucracies kind of not really digging that people are doing this work. There's a lot of different things there. But a lot of it is also because folks talk a big game about this stuff, but when it comes down to the details and being like, how do we actually do that? There isn't a lot of resources or kind of work out, right? There's maybe a lot of academic papers and like trials in the lab, but not enough stuff in the field, right? And so I think one neat thing is hopefully we're all going to be brainstorming and talking about how to get that work out there more, and that's why you guys are here, right? Because you want to actually do this work and bring it out into community. And it has a long way to go, but it's like a super necessary path that we got to take. So first, just to define, we're calling this kind of stuff grassroots bioremediation, for lack of a better word. And I'm going to contrast it in a second with conventional remediation, which is what we see in terms of industry and government, how they clean up contamination in the landscape. But grassroots bioremediation, I define it by working with living systems to detoxify contaminated environments. And the living systems we're talking about are the microorganisms, the plants, and the fungi. And they all do this in different ways, right? And so sometimes they might bind up a contaminant that kind of like lock it in, or they might make it inert by like kind of binding and combining it with other things, like I was talking about with the lead and the phosphorus, right? Some things like plants and mushrooms, depending on what species you're working with, will actually pull up different contaminants and kind of concentrate them in their own body or release them into the atmosphere. And some things like plants and mushrooms, both of them, will actually transform a contaminant and break it down into something that's more inert. So that's how they work. And there's probably a lot of other ways they do this work and we just haven't gotten savvy to it yet, but that's how we're rolling right now. So when we talk about microbial remediation, we're talking about working with primarily like the microorganisms. People talk about bacteria a lot in that one. When we talk about phytoremediation, that's the plants. And microremediation, as you all know, is the fungi, right? What I've noticed, I did about 2 years, a year and a half of like research on some of this stuff. And I was interviewing lots of different people for this book and trying to kind of find out the different recipes and the ways that they were doing the work. And I found it really interesting that a lot of folks are really, really specialized in their things. So you have the people who are the microbial remediation people, you have the phyto folks, and then you have the fungi folks, right? And they're really good at what they do and they're getting better every day. But there needs to be more links between them and more kind of trying to figure out how these things connect and combine, because in nature, they work together, right? And I think there is some research to that, and there are some people who are thinking about how they do that. And people are always talking about, for example, how fungi are an initiator species and how they kind of get other things going in the environment. But we got to get better at understanding kind of how they work, when they work together, and also the different kind of sites that you're going to work with may select for one over the other. You might have to start off, like you might want to start with mushrooms, but that might not be the way you start because of the site you're working with. And you might want to start off with plants, but you got to start somewhere else, right? And you have to work with that landscape and kind of do more what it needs you to do than kind of that one kind of way to go. So it's not about being dogmatic and being like, this one thing will save the world. It's about actually embracing diversity, right? We should always embrace diversity in life. Life lesson. Next one. Yeah. Okay. So I guess I want to ask you guys this question. Why do you think grassroots bioremediation is important? Yes, I hate nuclear. Just because there's smiley faces on that doesn't mean I like it. But I just made me feel happy about the image. Why is it important, grassroots remediation?
Because there's more pollution being created and taken care of.
In a successful way.
And successful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a lot of successful, any sort of things that are actually keeping everything out and producing a full circle.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, absolutely.
The ability to do it yourself and not have to pay somebody else to do it.
Yeah.
Because clearly the people who did it, you can't sue them. They're not going to do it. They're not going to pay for it. So instead of pulling money out of your pocket to pay somebody to do it, it's easier.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very powerful one.
More
And I would add to that, the people who are certified, the conventional remediation folks, and professional kind of bioremediation folks, they cost money, and some communities can't afford it. And we live in a world where often polluting industries, dumps, and things like that are cited in lower income neighborhoods, communities of color, indigenous communities, right? As a form of environmental racism, they get pushed there. And so those are usually the folks who are getting a lot of the impacts, but do not have access to the resources. And I think we also know that no matter what community you have, it seems like these guys suck at cleaning up their mess. Really, that's kind of how it goes. We see oil spills happen, and even though these communities, these companies are like, oh yeah, we know how to fix it, we have all this technology, they don't know how to fix it. Anyone who watched the Gulf oil spill go down, or even what happened in Arkansas back in March, they used paper towels. That's from the Arkansas spill up there. They use like a special kind of paper towel to clean it up, which is actually a legitimate way to clean it up, but still, that's what they're dealing with, and they're telling you to step back because they know better, right? And oftentimes, I have friends who live in communities where there's been oil spills. The professionals come up, they clean out everything, or they think they clean out everything. Usually they make a lot of people sick because they're using a lot of chemicals and things like that. And then months after, years after, you can still find oil in the land, right, or in the water. And so regardless of whether it should be falling onto the shoulders of communities to do this work and of folks on the front lines, it is because of the system we live in. So it's good to skill up, right, and figure out how to do that work. Other reasons why it's important. Yeah.
Can be more accessible for people to take it into their own hands and like, yeah, I don't know, I just think it's more accessible for everyone to like do this and share this.
Yeah, totally. Anything else?
Empowering people to take charge of their own lives is something the world needs a lot more of, instead of giving our power away to corporations or people who can supposedly fix problems and aren't doing anything in our favor. We can empower ourselves and those people around us to really make actual change happen.
So it's a good way to let you bond with nature in general. That way, you can use nature for whatever use. If you want to travel somewhere, using nature rather than using something that we don't know how. We know how it works, but we don't know how to, reverse the fact that we made it that way.
Yeah. And I guess I would add to that, it's really important to empower people, especially folks who are committed to the places where they live, because they will make sure a different kind of healing work happens to that landscape because they're committed to being there long term. Than someone who gets paid to come in, clean things up, and then leave. And that can take on a bunch of different definitions. And also, a lot of the folks who are doing some of this conventional remediation work, some of them are amazing people and they have incredible hearts and are trying to do the best that they can, but a lot of them come from a little bit more of a different paradigm where it's a lot about engineering, it's a lot about mechanics, there's a very strong focus on chemistry, and sometimes on money, right? And less of a thing on biology, less of a thing on kind of holistic healing kind of ideas. So sometimes I think of it as taking some of this work shouldn't just be falling, healing work shouldn't be falling to the hands of necessarily business folks, when there's other people who actually have a healing mind and a healing kind of way about them, because this is healer work, right? And it's being like a direct responder to the planet instead of a person. But there are people who, because they love the land or because they have a certain set of skills where they're working with the earth and they're working with these different species, they might do this work in a different way that might be more holistic. And so it's like also trying to bring them into that work, because I think, again, when we talk about the system is limited by the imagination of people who are in it, we need to expand that, because those problems are not going away, and they actually are more than the current system knows how to handle, right? So that's where you all come in. Yeah, and then I would say, like, also the fact is, like, why we're doing this work is that people need to grow food, they need to grow medicine, right? And more we're learning that we can't necessarily do that in our backyards. We can't do that in the places that we thought were healthy, because we're finding out that because of our society and like how we build and how we live and the different industries that have been there, we've inherited a toxic legacy that make it so that I can't have a garden here. Or those amazing medicinal plants that I used to go and harvest are actually contaminated now, right? Like we all know, like mushrooms they hyperaccumulate things like radiation. So they're really good medicine unless you're dealing with an irradiated environment, potentially, right? Same thing with seaweed. So finding ways to like clean up these environments, because if we don't, we won't have access to our food and medicine the way we want to. And if we live in a city, we need to find ways to like grow food in the city, right? And that's one of the challenges that we're always working against, because the land that's clean is often too expensive for folks, and the land that nobody wants to use is what's actually available. So, make sense? Okay. And I hate nuclear energy. It's going to be weird. We'll talk about that later. So conventional remediation, I just kind of think, I never get to talk about this in most of my workshops, because I do like really short workshops with people who have never heard about this stuff before, and it's kind of exciting, and you just want to get them really jazzed about everything, but I feel like you guys would go a bit deeper, because you kind of want to take a little bit of a longer ride. But in order to do this work, it's important to know kind of what is already going on out there, right? So when you come onto the scene and you say, hey, I have this amazing idea, I want to use microremediation, a city official, right, might be like, oh, I don't know about that, because I'm used to doing any of the following things, right? Because there is a whole empire and industry of cleanup. And a lot of it is, you know, it's kind of like Western medicine versus other forms of medicine. It's like there might be things in there that are actually helpful, because we've done so much damage to the land that we might need to do an intensive intervention. But by and large, a lot of these techniques are either out of our realm of possibility because we don't have the money or the expertise, or some of them are just kind of gnarly. So I just wanted to put that out there. But in my book, which I'm going to have out, and you guys can either buy it or you can just like write it down, or I can like send you like just like a Word document, I have a whole section that goes through every different conventional remediation kind of that's common and says what it is. And so that way, at least if you're interested, you can kind of get up to date on it. I'm not going to go through it right now because it's boring. But just to kind of know that there's things like one of the main things people do with contaminated land is they will dig it out and dump it somewhere else. That's like a solution, right? So you take the dirt that's contaminated, you go put it in somebody else's backyard in a landfill that will eventually leak at some point in the future, and then you go mine clean earth from somewhere else and put it in the hole. Does that seem like a good? No, not a permaculture solution at all, right? And so there's different ways to do that, and at some point again, we're gonna run out of the space to dump that stuff, and also of like clean stuff to move in there. And so we're trying to find different solutions. There's other things they do where they basically will wash the soil with different chemicals, and eventually like it will remove certain contaminants, but you'll end up with soil that has no biology left. So you've cleaned it, but it's essentially sterile, right? So that's not necessarily going to help, because we're going to learn in a couple of minutes how important it is to actually have the biology in the soil in order for everything else to kind of be working in your system. People burn contamination. They find ways to like inject it or like kind of make it really, really hot to the point that it turns into a block of glass. It's kind of interesting. There's just a lot of things going on. And then there's also conventional bioremediation, which is often spraying fertilizer on contaminated soil or on like an oil slick to kind of feed the bacteria, this kind of synthetic thing, and then it blooms, and then maybe it eats the oil and what you're going for. And that can sometimes work, but then you're also using this substance that can also wash into the water and, you know, kind of nutrient overload everything. So that's another thing to be aware of. Land farming, if you guys have never heard about that before, in the oil and gas industry, they like to take kind of like oily contaminated sludge and kind of spread it out on a field and be like, woo, oxygen, do your thing. Which eventually will do its thing, but if they don't do it right, it's going to be releasing a lot of toxic things and potentially contaminating the groundwater. And this happens a lot in Alberta. So yeah, just a lot of things like that. Good to know about if you ever want to get more into this stuff. Any questions? Yes.
What about, instead of dealing with their mess, reselling it as fertilizer, which happens all over the place all the time, and it's a huge industry of fertilizers that are actually made out of toxic waste that companies didn't want to have to pay to deal with, and so they resell it, and then people eat it and they get sick.
Or they put it in the water.
Yeah.
Or they blow it up.
And they make building materials out of it too. Like they take like things when they incinerate things, they'll take some of the byproducts of that and put it in concrete. That's exciting. And also just say like things like incineration can create a lot of other contaminants like dioxins and stuff that are going to last in the environment for a long time and make a lot of people sick. So again, some of these things, there might be a time and a place where you're like, whoa, this is all we can do. But they have a really, sometimes they have a really gnarly other side, right? And again, I don't own an incineration plant, so that's not my option, and nor will I ever. Another thing to remember with remediation is the difference between in situ remediation and ex situ. You folks know what that is? If you're not reading the slide, it's up there. What?
Are you ready?
Yeah? You want to say it anyway so I don't have to?
Well, in situ
In situ.
is like, I guess is where you do all the restoration right there in the local area. And then ex situ is like when you take the soil somewhere else to get treated.
Yeah. So that can be like, again, it's like, the more, you don't, sometimes people will like take the soil or take like the water or whatever and like move it or take the contamination and move it elsewhere. And in doing that, you might have a spill, like there's all these kind of risks involved, and it's also expensive. That kind of transport, that much stuff is expensive. So always, if you can, to treat it on site is your best option, it's your most affordable option. And sometimes ex situ, for our purposes, can actually mean that instead of like we have this sludgy pit of oil, like working in it, we might take that stuff over here, put it in like a bunch of other little bins, and try to like work it over here. That's also ex situ, right? But you're kind of like not working with the contamination exactly where it is, you're kind of moving it out, right? So just important, makes you sound smart when you say it. Okay, another foundational thing is that we need to understand the contaminants that we work with. And I think folks might already know this, but difference between metals and chemicals. Who can tell me the difference when it comes to remediation? Super important. Anybody? Yeah?
Chemicals, for the most part, you can break down into simpler compounds, whereas metals are in their, or should be in their elemental form, and it's not something you break down, you actually have to dispose of it.
Yeah. So that's super important. If you have metal contamination, you are never, like, it doesn't matter what you do, you're always going to be dealing with that metal. So that's the question that came up in our circle where we were saying, if we use mushrooms, if we use plants to like pull these metals up, what are we going to do with it? There's no way, it doesn't get pulled up as a plant and somehow become a rainbow or something awesome. It is still that metal, right? So then when we dispose of it, did you want it to be a rainbow?
Double rainbow.
Double rainbow, yeah, not yet. But when we dispose of it, we're trying to deal with that metal. So back in the day, this is like maybe 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, after Hurricane Katrina, there was some bioremediation stuff that happened during Hurricane Katrina. That was pretty awesome. And it got a lot of people really stoked on like using plants to like clean up contamination. And so people were taking sunflowers and trying to clean up things like lead and arsenic with it. And then they were taking the sunflowers and then composting them and then spreading it on garden beds. And being like, boo, yeah, look at us closing the cycle. Knowledge is power, and ignorance can make people really sick. So basically, really important is that once you have a metal, you're dealing with that metal. And you can find ways to isolate it, to extract it, to bind it, to hide it, but it will not break down, right? And so that's just really important to keep in your mind. Whereas chemicals have other kind of ways you can transform them, break them down, or extract them. So that's kind of
So if we're
important.
reading like metals like auto cars and like lead or aluminum, breaking down those elements with, you know, natural, like some sort of like a mushroom or something like that, versus the chemical, which would be like taking those chemicals and breaking them back into the elements to
Yeah.
then restore. Okay.
That's right. So like metal, we're trying to bind it, or we're trying to pull it out, right, and then get rid of it. But that's what we're always dealing with. It's like lead is lead is lead, right?
Yeah.
Except in those moments where we can like, again, when I talked about lead paramorphite,
Yeah.
we're still dealing with lead, but we found a way to like connect it with something else that changed the structure and made it more inert, right? But we didn't break it down. Whereas like if we're dealing with oil, and I think Maya was talking about this with saprophytic fungi, how they'll sit there and they'll take the hydrocarbon molecule and they'll snip it and rearrange it into a complex sugar, which you couldn't do with a metal, right? Yeah. So just important to know that. contaminants in general, it's really important when you're doing this work. It's like if you're any kind of healer needs to know like, you know, how the body works, but also the different systems and the different kind of illnesses and injuries that you're working with. You need to kind of know what contaminants you're working with because they're all different and they have different ways of kind of adhering and kind of persisting in the environment. And they even like deal with like acidity differently, right? So if you know what you're working with, you can kind of be more specific. And also it just helps you choose what living ally you're going to engage, like whether it's going to be plants or mushrooms or which species or which strains and all that kind of stuff. So some of the common ones you might find on a site, you know, we're talking like in terms of metals, lead, arsenic, nickel, cadmium, chromium, mercury, copper. Oftentimes you find these things together if you're, you know, fortunate, unfortunate. So for example, we'll find lead and arsenic together often because of certain pesticides where they use them together, right? So that's just important to know. And they have different strategies in terms of getting rid of them. In terms of the chemicals, some of the chemicals we're working with are PAHs. Does anybody know what PAHs are? Polycyclic hydrocarbons. So things like naphthalene, stuff like that.
Polyaromatic.
Polyaromatic. Yes, thank you. I always make that one mistake. So they have a certain way of kind of reacting. Volatile organic compounds, which is what VOCs are. So those are things like different solvents, benzene, toluene. These ones, like they tend to, they're very volatile, right? Hence the name. So like when you have, let's say, an oil spill, there's a certain amount of that oil that's going to stay where it is, and then there's a bunch of these volatile organic compounds that are going to basically like evaporate, right? And go kind of more into an airborne state. And things like benzene and toluene are carcinogenic. They're not friendly at all. So it's important to kind of know the differences and like what different activities create them, right? And where you likely find them. POPs basically are persistent organic pollutants. And why they're important is because their name kind of says it all. They're a type of chemical that lasts a long time. And so things like DDT, where we might have banned that, I think we both, Canada and America, banned DDT a while ago, like 30 years ago maybe. It could still be around because it takes that long for it to break down. It really resists being broken down in the environment. And PCBs, similarly, dioxins and furans are another one. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things that create it. So sometimes it's the chemicals we bring onto the land via pesticides. Sometimes it's things like the incineration process or pulp mills can create some of these things as well. So just keep in mind. And then we have radiation, which is a bummer in so many ways. Because you can't really, in a lot of ways, I would also just, I guess, there's certain things we've inherited in terms of toxic legacies that we haven't quite figured out how to deal with. So I'm not going to be able to tell you guys, like, oh my God, we know how to handle radiation, we have this amazing mushroom that'll pick it up, and then, again, turn it into a double rainbow. It's not there yet. Like, we don't have it. And conventionally, they have no idea how to handle radioactive waste, because it's one of those things that we should have never done, right? And so we're kind of inheriting these things that are, like, pretty big, and we can probably figure out some ways to make it better, but to be kind to yourself, because you are inheriting problems that, again, people down the line really didn't ever consider would be a problem or didn't think it was important enough to address because of the values that they had.
They're good intentions most of the time.
Or they just didn't have enough love for the land or for the future generations. Either one. Yeah. Spicy kid Indian. We do exist. So, right? Yeah. Soil and plant testing. So, okay. One of the things to say is that in terms of the different contaminants, I also have a list of what they are and kind of the different places you find them, like the different products that create them. Because as we were saying earlier, in order to do this work, it really helps you to know, A, what you're dealing with, right? So what's actually on your site or in like that pile of dirt that you really are kind of confused about or in the water that you're trying to drink. It's really important to know what you're dealing with. And it's also important to know whether what interventions or remediation you're doing, is it working or is it not? And sometimes we can tell by looking at it, but more often than not, we can't. And if we can't test our kind of effectiveness, then we don't really know, really, is what we're working or is what we're doing working. And I know a lot of really amazing people who have a lot of faith in plants and in mushrooms, but it's not enough. Like we're dealing with serious things and we kind of have to know, right? Especially if people are going to start eating off that land or, drinking and doing all that kind of stuff. So with that in mind, soil testing, plant testing, water testing, things like that can be really important to this work, but they are expensive, and they can be inaccessible. So oftentimes you have to do a bit of fundraising to kind of get the resources to do that work, or you have to like make the right relationships with different.
We'll just do more water.
Oh yeah, it was actually more like my security
But
blanket.
don't put it on the piano.
Don't put it on the piano.
Yeah.
Please help keep liquids away from the piano. Gotcha. Thank you for the reminder. Where was I even going with that? If you can't get the funding to kind of cover this stuff, then trying to ally yourself with different universities that might do that testing for free and kind of connect with like their different research departments and stuff like that. So I know some folks where I'm from in Vancouver, I'm not from Vancouver, but I've been living there, they've been working with the soil department in the university to get free soil testing, right? And I also look at universities and I'm like, that's a lot of resources that are not being turned necessarily out to the public good. So it's like trying to find a way to make those things work for the people is really important. And get people who are actually doing research that's not just about navel gazing and hoarding knowledge and actually making communities healthier. So if you can do that, that's really awesome. There are, I know in the States you guys have extension offices. Some states have, yes? And that you can get cheaper or free soil testing in those situations. So that's helpful. But regardless, in any remediation project, you're going to want to do this not just once, but maybe a couple of times to kind of see if what you're doing is working. Because if you know what you're doing is working, you can either share it with everybody you know, right? Or you can actually tweak your system and try to find ways to make it work better. Because sometimes a plant or a mushroom might not be taking up a contaminant or doing that remediation because something's off in the soil, because the pH is off, or because you used the wrong species. And like, just being able to test that could mean a huge success or failure, right? So that's really important. One thing to know when you're doing soil testing is you need to know what you're asking for. So don't just like send in a bunch of soil to a lab and be like, hey, what's in it? Ask for the test that you need. Tell them that you're looking for the following contaminants, and that's kind of what you need to have in terms of information. Because if you don't tell them what you're looking for, they either will give you a really general test that will not cover that and you've wasted your money, or they might be able to kind of give you a test that kind of covers a broad range of things that you're actually trying to find out. Does that make sense? And different labs will test for different things, so just kind of get savvy on that. Also, you have options, like sometimes, again, soil testing is really expensive in some situations, depending on whether you're doing metals or chemicals or both, but there's a difference between something called a single sample and a composite sample. So a single sample, again, because I said it's expensive, if this carpet was a piece of land we're trying to test, if I took one sample from over here and gave it to a soil company, they would tell me whether that had anything in it. But what if the contamination was over there? I'd have no idea. But I might not be able to actually pay for that many tests to figure out all the different places it might be in my landscape. So sometimes when people can't afford that, like your best option is to kind of do a bit of like a grid and kind of a diagonal kind of path throughout your site and cover all these different areas. Unless you know that this might have been the contamination site, right? But if you don't have the money for that, you can only do one sample because they basically charge you by the sample. Then you can do something called a composite sample where you take like kind of a bunch of different samples from all over your site and then take bits of that and mix it together and get that tested. And then that'll tell you whether there's contamination on your site, it won't tell you where. So it's not the best thing, but at least you'll know, right? So you wouldn't have tested over here and been like, we're good, and it's actually like all over there, right? Important to know. Again, if you can do some rockstar fundraising, you might be able to avoid a lot of the stress around that. Other testing to do that's really helpful is knowing your soil pH. Super important. Because your soil pH will actually, if you're dealing with different metals, it makes, under certain like low pHs, there's a certain type of metal, like we have cationic metals and we have anionic metals. So things like lead is a cationic metal, arsenic is anionic. And under certain pHs, if you have a low pH, something like lead is way more soluble and moving in that kind of soil. It can be taken up by plants, it can kind of go into the water table a little bit easier. Under a more alkaline pH, that actually slows right down. And actually trying to modify the pH sometimes can be the thing that actually makes your metal immobilized.
Can you say that again?
Yes. Fist pump? Too fast. Okay. So, okay. We have different types of metals. We got that part, right? Cationic, anionic. I have a list of the different ones that I can show you later. But two of the really common ones that kind of we often find together, but that are two different kinds of metals, are lead and arsenic. And when you have things in a more acidic environment, it makes lead more mobile, right? So if you have like a low pH, anything below 7, your lead is going to be way more easily taken up by plants, right? Or by mushrooms, let's say. if you have a higher pH, so anything above 7, so we're more alkaline, it actually binds the lead. The lead kind of just slows down and becomes less bioavailable and can't move as easily through the system, right? And so sometimes people will try to do lead remediation by actually modifying their pH and bringing the pH up to kind of immobilize the metal.
What does it bind to in the alkaline environment?
I'm not quite sure, but it's like the characteristics of the metal somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I actually know that answer, but I need to look it up,
Sure.
because I have it written down. And if there is a question you have that I can't answer, write it down and then give it to me later, and I will go look it up, because that's something I want to do. Unless it's irrelevant, and I won't.
So you're pretty much saying that like lower pHs will have it easy, the plants specifically will have an easier time?
I've only heard about this around plants,
Okay.
so it doesn't mean it's in the same production, but it's like that metal is more soluble and more bioavailable, right? And so one of the things people tend to do, if they're trying to extract something like lead using a plant, is that they actually have to amend the soil to make it more acidic, otherwise they can't get the lead out, right? And so that's just something to think about, right? But the awkward thing is that arsenic reacts the exact opposite way. So when you immobilize your lead by kind of having a higher pH, your arsenic is just like, whoa, and it's just like flying around there, right? And it becomes more soluble and more bioavailable because it's an anionic metal, so it actually is the opposite.
Is it the
Right.
same for all cationic and or anionic?
Yes.
It's all the same
Yeah.
pattern?
And I can't remember, I think arsenic and chromium are anionic, and lead, cadmium, and a few others are cationic, but I can get you guys that information. I used to have it on my slide and I took it off. So again, pH is important. There's also certain situations where you have a really low pH, where certain metals, like aluminum, if they're at a really low pH, they become incredibly phytotoxic. So if you're trying to grow something on a site and nothing will grow and you're just like, what's going on? Look at your pH. So someone was saying to me, like, soils that have a lot of clay in them also tend to have like aluminum, because it is a naturally occurring metal too, and at a really, really low pH, it becomes phytotoxic. So if you have an industrial site that's had, the pH all messed with, and you're having trouble growing stuff, and you can find a way to moderate that pH, you might be actually shifting up that phytotoxicity a little bit. So that's a little complicated, but it's just thinking like that. So find out your pH, and then you can figure it out and go from there. But really important. Another test that some folks like to do is a soil biology test. So kind of looking at your land and being like, okay, we know what contaminants are here, but we kind of want to know what allies are present as well in terms of the microorganisms that are there. So do we have any microorganisms? Do we have any fungi? Do we have, like what species of bacteria are here? Because oftentimes, industry or government has done a really good job of like sterilizing that landscape, right? And losing those microorganisms, and they are some of the beings that actually make it so that the soil operates and is healthy and functional. And so there are folks who will do those tests, or they'll test things like their compost tea to see if it's actually carrying the right microbes to do the work. And that's a test that people can actually learn how to do with a microscope and kind of figure out, and it's not as expensive. Or you can send it away to a lab and it is more expensive.
Compost tea, what does that mean?
I'm gonna hit it.
Okay, cool.
Good, and we might do a demo tomorrow.
Cool.
It's exciting.
Do you know what kind of measurements are made to assess the biology, soil biology?
Yeah, I mean, in the people who are just doing kind of like the microscope one, it's, they're looking for different species and they're telling you like, they can't tell you the numbers. They'll just say, hey, we found the following species present, right? And then the labs actually have ways to be like, you have this many thousand of this, like this much of that. And then you go through like the different bacteria, the protozoa, the nematodes, stuff like that.
Well, I mean, you can get to a certain extent. I have a friend that does arthropods, and
Okay.
she has a lot of them. And you can do a typical species count for like within like a petri dish, just under like a dissecting scope, and you can actually start like with a clicker and get like different. But it's harder to identify past the order sometimes, especially with like arthropods and microorganisms. A lot of those to identify them further, there's a lot of chemical tests you have to go through. So like you can get it to like a basic, to where you can get enough information about like microorganisms, but it's like you only get so much of it in soil biology just by like hands-on.
Sometimes in remediation stuff, soil biology can be really important in the sense of you have an oil spill and you're trying to figure out what type of bacteria is present already in the environment. And if you know what it is, and then you can figure out what to feed it, that's like they're trying to figure that piece out, right? And so that's a moment where it can be really effective too. But yeah, it's something you can do. Again, it might not be your first thing you go to, but some folks really like that. We're going to talk about bioassays at some point in the course, so I'm not going to hit it. But this is a cheaper way to do kind of soil testing and figure out like contaminants and not. Cheaper and different, but really important in terms of like a grassroots tool, because again, you're not depending on the lab, right? And then if you have no money and you're just like, man, I need to figure out like how to clean up this piece of land and what to use, your site history is really important. So figuring out, doing the research, what was here before, and whether that's going through different records in the city or asking people in your neighborhood and being like, hey, like, you know, like going back 50 years, 60 years, what has been on this land? If you know that, then you can go through and be like, what kind of pollutants does this industry leave behind? What kind of pollutants are found in this kind of paint? And just like figure out what you might be dealing with. And you might not know whether it's actually present in like concentrations to make it a problem, but at least you can kind of like have an idea and just go from there. Does that make sense? Is this too heavy?
No.
Okay,
No.
we're good? You like deeper? Deeper we go. I'm gonna go through this stuff really fast, but because I kind of want to get us to the happy stuff. But an example of what I was just saying is like gas stations, for example. You have an old gas station. If you can't test the soil, there's research and there's kind of like, you know, people have already kind of done, I guess, some of the sampling, and they can tell you that often at old gas station sites, we'll find things like benzene, MTBE, which is a gasoline additive. We're looking at things like naphthalene. We're dealing with lead. So oftentimes on a site, you're finding multiple chemicals and metals together. If there's an auto shop attached to that, then you're dealing with a bunch of solvents and a whole bunch of other things. And so this kind of information is out there, and you can pretty easily find it, right? And it doesn't mean that you're going to be dealing with all of this, because maybe that gas station actually cleaned up something, or maybe they actually had ways to contain their spills, but you also might be dealing with it, right? Another thing to just know about gas stations is they have this awesome acronym called LUST, which I think is really hilarious. And it stands for Leaking Underground Storage Tanks. So oftentimes we look at a gas station, we're like, oh my God, I really want to clean that up. And it's like, that's amazing, but the contamination you're dealing with might be fairly deep, and it might be hard for you using a plant or a mushroom to get at it on the surface, right? Because things like the hydrocarbons, they've migrated down. And so figuring out where your contamination is in that site is really important to what you use to clean it up, or whether it's within your scope. That make sense? Next one. Again, if it's like a rail yard, this is just some different examples of like a site. Oh my God, what's there? These are some of the things that might be there. You can keep going. Dry cleaners are awful.
Back to that one. Sorry.
Oh, rail yards? I can also like give you guys this stuff. So like, don't worry about like copying it all down. But,
I just wanted to think about that.
yeah, totally.
My garden's right along the railroad tracks.
Hey. And what's important is, again, if you understand some of these different contaminants, you would also be able to know, like, okay, if my garden's here and there's, you know, a certain kind of contaminant over here, what's the chance that that actually migrated or not? Because some things are way more mobile than others, right? Also, the soil that you're working with, if you're dealing with like a more sandy soil versus a clay soil, things tend to move quicker. It's just, these are important things to know in sandy soil versus clay soil, right? So just keeping all those things in mind are important. Keep going. Anyway, dry cleaner's awful, lots of solvents. Another thing is just because it's green doesn't mean it's clean, right? And so things like parks, things like orchards, and, you know, old farmland can be full of things like heavy metals and pesticides. So if you're kind of getting into something like that, you might want to do some work to kind of deal with those. And sometimes they're not, you never know, right? Which is why testing is important. Yes?
What did POP stand for again?
POP, it's persistent organic pollutants.
Okay.
Yeah. So just before, again, we get into the juicy stuff, I keep going to my cup and I cannot do it. Just before we get to that, this is just to give you guys the idea of when you're kind of thinking about how to kind of go forward with remediation, to really kind of employ, like you're talking about permaculture, like observe and kind of ask questions about the site that you're dealing with, right? And so kind of like walking onto that piece of land and not just being like, I'm going to put a mushroom installation here, but actually being like, hey, what's the history? What kind of contaminants are here? Where are they in the land? Are they coming onto the land? Are they deep? Are they shallow? Because that'll influence what you do. What's your timeline? Do you have like 5 years to work on this, or do you have 2 years to work on this? And that'll influence, again, a different strategy or tool that you might use. Do you have a lot of people to help you, or is it just you and your friend, right? That would also be something to think about. Looking at the site and asking like what significant cycles and ecological functions are gone, and what work do you have to do to bring it back? Because if you can bring that back, you'll also be helping that land heal itself. Looking for different signs of like bird, animal, and human use in that site, because if there's a lot of animals using that site, you might want to find ways to like maybe mitigate their access to certain areas that are highly contaminated. So if you have a sludge pool, and you keep seeing tracks that are going to the sludge pool, you might want to try to fence that off so that you're not having these animals consistently poison themselves. If you see humans using this area a lot, you might find ways to put up signs, or if you start to do remediation work, have some education so people aren't, I don't know, crushing your micro installations or stealing your bunker bags and stuff like that. It's important. These are all factors to think about, and especially humans, because they can be incredible allies, and if they don't know what you're doing, they can also grind it to a halt, right? So really important to get that on board.
Something with signage that somebody brought up the other day that would be important is especially when working in inner cities to make sure you have like images, because a lot of people are illiterate and don't understand what's going on. So.
Yeah, or different languages.
Yeah.
Right? Super important. Absolutely. Like a really good example of like why you might want to sign is if I'm trying to clean up some area with plants and doing phytoremediation, and I'm using something that might also be edible. There's like neighborhood children who are coming through and like foraging. It's like they might eat these plants that are hyperaccumulating a metal or a mushroom, right? And so just having some sign that's like, hey, not yet, right? So really important. Keep going. Yeah, if there's water, like where does water flow through the site? Where does it run off to? Where does it pool? All questions to ask, because that'll influence like where you put your installations. Also, like maybe that's a resource for you on your site as well. The soil, how does your soil look, right? Is it compacted? If so, we're gonna have to do a certain amount of work to kind of open it up so that it can actually be conducive to like plants and microbes doing their work. What the texture is, as I said, the pH, really important. Where are there plants growing on your site? If you have a site that has plants everywhere and then one bald patch and there's nothing there, you might want to test that bald patch first, right? Because that might be an indicator of like something's really wrong in that area, right? That's important. The different kind of plants that are growing could tell you something about whether the soil is really acidic or basic or salty, or some plants have an affinity with certain forms of contamination. And so that might actually also be able to tell you what's going on. And there could be way more research done to say, hey, we often find this plant in the following contaminated areas, and that might be another way that people kind of can get around some of the testing if they can't afford it. But that's a long ways away and it's not super clear. If there's any debris piles on your site, any weird substances, you got to figure out what to do with them. You definitely don't want to smell them or test them, right? So that's just important. And then also looking at things like where is the sun in your site? Because sun and shade, moisture, all those things really influence your ability to do mushrooms or plants. And you're going to have to do some work to like kind of moderate and modify. Make sense? Okay. You guys look sleepy. You a little sleepy?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I did with lunch.
I know.
You're doing great.
Yeah? But grab caffeine, because we got a long way to go. Or stand up and do like a shimmy shake. Keep going.
Or move spots, that helps.
That also helps. You can skip that one. I actually had like the slide I just did, but I don't want to talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it briefly, is in order to do this work, see it's really small. You should never make slides that have multiple small pieces of writing on it because it's just confusing. But I sometimes do this for my own memory because I feel like I won't remember if I don't put it up there. But this is just a thing to be like, in order to do this work, we need to have many different skills. Or you need to have friends who all have complementary skills that are different, right? Because as you're kind of noticing, it's like, it's not just about one thing, it's not just about specializing, it's important to specialize. And you guys are all here to get really good at mushrooms, right? But then you need to kind of guild up, which is like a permaculture term, or like beneficial species kind of get together and form these like super awesome like associations of just abundance. You need to figure that out and find people who have different skills than you, because this is a big deal. And it's not just knowing how to cultivate mushrooms, it's knowing how to cultivate plants, it's knowing how to work with microbes and know how to do like really rockstar composting, which someone like Bob Ross is going to talk to you about. It's knowing how to actually write fundraising proposals so you can actually afford a soil test, right? It's knowing things like oil spill response, you know, how to actually like set up irrigation, chemistry, contaminants. If you can find people who have that information, either form like really awesome teams with those folks or become their friends and use them as mentors and allies, because that means you're going to be able to do this work in a really good way. That makes sense? So skill up and guild up. Good. And it is important, like we come from a world where there's a lot of like, we're kind of, what is it, jack of all trades and masters of none. We know a lot of general things, but sometimes when it comes to like really specific, like we all know mushrooms are awesome, but not all of us know how to cultivate them. It sometimes takes actually getting really specific and being like, I actually have that skill that I can bring to a group, because we don't have enough people who know how to do that, right? So that's really important. So looking at your community and saying, what are we missing here when it comes to this work, and then going and investing in yourself or in others to get that. Really important.